Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. As always, I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and we welcome back Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert. So this will be probably a quick-hitting episode today, but a good lead into things that we'll be watching really probably throughout the summer and the fall, because the main point we'll get to here in the back half of the episode probably is that the counteroffensive that we've been we collectively, commentators, most of the world have been talking about for the last several months by Ukraine does seem to be underway. So we will get to that here in a little bit, but we also have a couple other items to update you all on as well. So we'll get right to that. So Yuval, welcome back. And what would you like to start us off with here?
Pleasure as always to be with you, Ian. Yes, we've been talking about the forthcoming, impending, soon-to-be counteroffensive that's starting right now. But just to keep going on several other basically storylines of what's happening basically on the Russian side, on basically opposite sides of, let's just call it Russia's future. Sort of the two big items for this basically over the past week or so is that there were several opposition in exile conferences sponsored by various European organizations, including by the European Union through the European Parliament. So in Brussels, Vilnius, and Warsaw, there's now sort of serious discussions about what does the future of Russia look like. And obviously, this is something that we'll be touching upon basically for the rest of the summer, because in a certain way, whatever happens on the battlefield helps shape the ideas of what war termination look like, and war termination then basically help, if not determine or define, what is post-war Ukraine-Russia relations. We will have some better sense, by the end of the counteroffensive, the end of the summer fighting season, what's the relative strength and resilience of the Russian state to potentially very bad news from the battlefield. And so in this regard, a number of the basically opposition groups in exile are articulating what does it actually mean to be Russian, and what does it mean to be a Russian in Europe? There's a lot to say here, but the key question that a lot of these organizations are trying to bring up is whether this is a war that belongs to Putin and basically his circle, his government, or whether this is a conflict that belongs to all Russians. This conversation could take the next 2 minutes, or it could take the next 2 to 20 years. But ultimately, what we're trying to figure out, or what we're observing right now, is how much of this war is going to shape not only the rest of Putin's time in office, but what happens to Russia afterwards. And obviously the people who are anticipating, trying to take power, in Russia, if and when Putin goes, what they're trying to steer towards is that this is Putin's war. This belongs to him. This belongs to the power structures. So when they're talking about effectively lustration, lustration is what do you do with basically the bad guys once the regime falls? The old heads in the audience might remember debathification, order number one. Do you get rid of literally everyone? Or do you basically say, we'll take the guy at the top and basically the next 100 people in terms of power? And then you say, once we remove just that tiny sliver, then basically we'll be fine with more or less everyone else staying in power. So that's the big question that they're trying to introduce. How many of Putin's people need to go in order to have a new type of Russian state? Now, I just wrote a book in which the entire argument of that book is Russian political culture has been more or less fairly stable since the time of Peter the Great. And even removing lots of people, such as, the Bolshevik Revolution, didn't really change all that much, because once Stalin comes into power, he effectively recreates a system that had been working in Russia for a very long time before him. So the question of Putin is the question of post-war, and post-war lustration in particular. A lot of these other groups are trying to also articulate at the same time. There's, roughly 300 plus $billion of, Russian money that was frozen in Europe. All that money's been collecting interest since. And so at this point, from the beginning of the conflict to now, this is now in the neighborhood of $340, $350 billion. This war is going to continue for a while. That number is going to grow and grow and grow. And so the big question, again, that these people are trying to raise is, how many of the current Russian state need to go? What do you do with that money? And what do you do with basically the sanctions in place? And a lot of these machinations are basically trying to put all these moving parts into one big idea. How much of that money returns to Russia in return for political reform that then goes to sanctions relief, that then basically allows Russia to reintegrate into the broader world? The other side of the conversation is, people who are obviously much more anti-Russia and are not seeking to take power in Russia, is they want Russia to essentially be cast out of the family of nations. All that money goes into basically Ukrainian reparations to then reduce the burden that's placed on the rest of the world, and just let Russia, take 40 years and wander in the desert. So that's the conversations that are already beginning. That's a good place to then introduce what's happening inside Russian domestic politics right now. Now, you, Ian, Major in the United States Marine Corps, you might be concerned, you might be following the news about what's happening in the actual conflict, balance of forces, that sort of thing. You, in fact, probably spend a lot of time thinking about this because you're interested in basically the shape of European security. Would it surprise you that Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defense, has not been paying as much attention to this as perhaps he might, and perhaps people like you and me might be doing right now? Because his main event over the past week is not basically, saying, here's what we're going to do in order to assist in the defense of, let's say, the quote unquote Russian territory, but he's continuing his spat with not the friend of the pod, but basically the third co-host of this pod, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defense, dispatched one of his subordinates to announce that from July 1st onwards, there will be no more private military companies operating in the name of the Russian Federation abroad, and that all such detachments must sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense as contract soldiers and subordinate themselves to the regular Russian military and cease any independent activity. So again, in the midst of something that might define the rest of basically Russia's 21st century, Shoigu is not spending 100% of his time dealing with the actual conflict, but continuing his bureaucratic spat with Prigozhin. And that to me is just insane. So how did Prigozhin respond to this? He called Sergei Shoigu not only very bad words, and he called him very bad names. He also introduced his own personal recommendation that Shoigu, Gerasimov, and all the people around him be executed by firing squad. And that was his gentle riposte to Shoigu's suggestions. And this is where we are right now. Shoigu said that the performance of the Russian military, like the actual Russian military in the field, means that if he were to subordinate his men to the military, that would be the collapse of the entire front, and that they would have to then fall back to Saratov, where basically the Great Russian Force begins, which is about 800 kilometers from the Russian border. And that's basically the state of Russian domestic politics at this time. The opposition is negotiating about lustration. Prigozhin and Shoigu continue to call for each other's death in ever more scatological terms. And today is Russia Day, June 12th. And Dmitry Medvedev had a photoshopped picture of the main square of Kiev, the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which is, the square of independence, with the Russian flag where the Ukrainian flag is. And he said, happy Russia Day, we'll be there soon enough. So if you want to just get the sense of what's going on on the Russian side of affairs.
Yeah, I have to say, I feel like maybe when and if this conflict comes to some sort of conclusion, there's got to be a market out there for like the best sayings of Prigozhin. Maybe a little coffee table book, because if nothing else, he is a very quotable, um, profane but quotable individual, and the creativity he has come up with in his insults has been, there's some inspiration there. But to your earlier point of like, would I have thought that this would have happened inside of a major, possibly existential conflict from one of these countries before this war started? I would have been like, no, that's insane. Like when you go in, you focus 100% on winning the conflict. But at this point, like I wouldn't be surprised if the two of them like started doing a thumb war in the middle of Red Square near the Kremlin, because the just the lack of prioritization of the thing, making the main thing the main thing. It blew my mind the first time, but as we keep seeing it, it's incredible to watch that even at this point, when I think the weekend of Ukraine's counteroffensive starting, this is what they're doing, right? They're not pointing all guns outward, getting ready to receive the counteroffensive, but they're pointing them right at each other. Circular firing squad, metaphorical circular firing squad at this point, may become a actual firing squad down the road. But Putin's tolerance for this has also been curious to watch, because as far as I can tell, maybe you can correct me there, he doesn't seem to have sort of, I mean, maybe Shoigu's thing of absorbing Wagner and other groups is Putin's response, but Putin himself has said nothing. Final point on this, then we can shift over to the counteroffensive. But one of the things that Wagner Group has done, and you're talking about the abroad, I assume this would include their forces in Africa, Syria, and elsewhere. But what Wagner is a source of like hard income, right? Back to the Russian regime. So what happens if if Shoigu gets his way and turns off that spigot of hard income?
Well, so I mean, so Prigozhin is nothing if not entrepreneurial. And the estimates on basically on like Wagner's collective activities, which includes gun running, basically diamond smuggling or diamond exports, several other sort of like precious metals, things of that nature, as well as industrial commodities, that Wagner itself is clearing effectively in the low billions, just like as a commercial organization. Prigozhin went into Ukraine because, one, he has the fighters, there is the opportunity, and any amount of glory that he particularly generates, or Wagner particularly generates, will obviously create a legitimation that you can't otherwise buy. And it's obvious that over the course of this conflict, the Minister of Defense, the Chairman of the General Staff have just covered themselves in absolute shame, and poor results, etc. So, it's clear like what Wagner's up to. So what Prigozhin is saying is, it's funny. There's a sort of a professor named Sergei Radchenko, who's at Johns Hopkins, was posted on Twitter the other day that he was reading something about Gorbachev's perestroika, etc. So we're talking like 1987, and Sergei Shoigu just totally randomly in the narrative just pops up as a person who was deeply in favor of perestroika and was promoting it, in some sort of factory in the middle of nowhere. And so you just think Sergei Shoigu is a bureaucratic survivor. The guy has come to the level of Minister of Defense without a military background. And he does it by basically never letting go of objective number one, which is keep surviving. And so he's now setting himself up for trying to take Prigozhin's entire business in the midst of a conflict. And Prigozhin is obviously not going to let him do it. Now, you ask sort of like what's Putin doing in this context? When in a normal state of affairs, in sort of like non-conflict situations, Putin is basically has had a lot of experience, has had a lot of success in terms of determining what is the timeline that things will move along. He can go as fast or as slow as he needs. He has basically the first and second mover advantage in each one of these bureaucratic fights. What's happening now is that because Ukrainians have a vote, Putin is not in full control of the situation. So people are making bolder decisions on their own and just assuming Putin will come and rescue them or will support them or endorse whatever it is that they're doing, so long as they can basically generate their own success. And that's actually quite dangerous for, what the Russians call the vertical of power, which is basically the vertical practice of, the authoritarian state. If people start making their own decisions, it'll start to unbalance all the different elite factions. And then people below don't know who's the real boss. Is it Shoigu? Is it Prigozhin? Is it somebody else? What if other people start freelancing? And that's essentially what this entire conflict between Prigozhin and Shoigu is threatening to unsettle for the entire Russian state.
Yeah, thanks for laying that out. And I think, obviously this is not the first time they've clashed and probably won't be the last, but the fact that this dynamic is escalating even further in the midst of, the biggest challenge to Russia's presence in Ukraine, which is the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has been on the horizon all this time, and now it's starting to roll out. And this is the time they pick to to form that circular firing squad on each other and slapping at each other for about who's really in charge.
In terms of thinking like the counteroffensive happening, and sort of we'll get into that. But again, the counteroffensive is underway, and Sergei Shoigu is not 100% committed to it. That is bureaucratic survival to the detriment of the larger mission. And I don't know if it could be any clearer. Self-over organization.
Indeed, and the from the Russian perspective, you could not have picked a worse time for this. For Shoigu to try and flex a little bit more muscle. So, but that maybe makes Ukraine's job a little bit easier, and the job that they already have is going to be a very difficult one. So let's shift on to the counteroffensive at this point, and to sort of like lay the groundwork. One, it sort of developed over the weekend that it sort of there was never going to be like a big booming statement from Kyiv that yes, it's underway, but reporting from frontline areas indicated that there were multiple Ukrainian offensive thrusts going on, and then over the weekend there was sort of a laconic statement from I think President Zelensky and some of the military leadership that yes, there are certain counteroffensive operations going underway, and then we've also gotten feedback via the Telegram channels and various open source intelligence folks who have been posting pictures and translations of individual very soda straw perspectives on the battlefield. But the message does seem clear that if it's not the main thrust yet of the counteroffensive, the initial thrusts are going out to potentially start finding pathways for that main thrust to go through. So if you want to maybe sort of lay out, and and another caveat is there's a lot we don't know. The Ukrainians have typically practiced very strict operational security, and so what information that's out there is very soda straw, like I said, but also we're probably at least it's a couple of days or so behind what information is coming out. So probably most of what we'll talk about is where things sort of stood 48 to 72 hours ago. But with all of that, Yuval, if you want to lay out maybe sort of what we know about where this the counteroffensive thrusts appear to be unfolding, initial sort of initial indications of what's been happening, whether successful or not, and then we were talking about you were looking at some of the Russian Telegram channels, which have been a source of information throughout the war, and maybe give us a sense of what they've been saying about it so far.
So sure. So in effect, the line of control here is almost 1,000 kilometers long in a certain sense. And certainly and by the way, just we're going to talk much more about what's happening in Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and into Luhansk. There are still these sort of like pro-Ukrainian Russian forces in Belgorod region. Like it's one of the things to keep in mind is 2 weeks ago, we're like, wow, it's crazy. Like pro-Ukrainian Russian forces have invaded Russia. like it's still going on. The last time we had an episode, we're like, oh, it looks like the Russians blew up a dam that is going to deprive like 700,000 people of drinking water. Like that's still happening. Um, and on that note, the Russians blew up another dam. There's one in a place called Mokry Yali, and Mokry means wet. So there's another river dam in the Donetsk region that was blown up to cause flooding, and which has basically slowed the advance of Ukrainian troops in that particular area. So when we then sort of retrospectively try to understand what happened at Nova Kakhovka, it seems quite clear that the Russians were legitimately afraid that the Ukrainians were coming, and were willing to even deprive Crimea of drinking water in order to not lose and not to and to hold the line in that particular area. So just to sort of, when we're thinking about again the preservation of human life and economic potential, what does the post-war conversation look like? Inducing man-made disasters like this should be part of the conversation going forward. But all that said, what we're looking at in terms of just stuff that we're seeing reported is, let's say, three or so main lines of attack. Sort of from south going, in a northeasterly direction, in Zaporizhia, which is, and again, we're talking about the areas that Russia has claimed for itself, annexed into the Russian Federation, but obviously where the control is not solid at this point. The sort of the one that has gotten the Russian military bloggers basically the most in a tizzy, I should say, is basically going south through a town called Arikhiv towards Tokmak, and which is on the way to Melitopol and potentially also to Mariupol. And the reason that this is important and the town of Tokmak is important, and again, one of the place names that you hadn't heard before, is that this is the railroad node of basically southern Ukraine. The Ukrainians have, in fact, bombed three additional railroad nodes further in Crimea. So two in Crimea, and including and also a train depot. We've talked about for the past 16, 17 months at this point, the Russians still move everything by rail. So the effect of going towards Tokmak to basically capture the rail junction, as well as then the bombing of rail nodes, rail junctions further south, is that this is preventing the Russians from bringing resupplies to the front. So when we then sort of, continue to move in a northeasterly direction to Novosilka and Marinka, which is basically to the west and southwest of Donetsk, and then moving further northeast towards Bakhmut, what we're seeing the Ukrainians doing is that they're approaching the Russian, defense in depth, which we'll talk about in a second, but they're going after basically the logistics of the Russian Federation behind basically the front lines, so that as the Ukrainian forces are starting to attack the first, second, and third lines of the Russian defense, they're basically, meeting the enemy, but then trying to ensure to the maximum extent possible supplies are not coming to resupply basically Russian forces, so that as Russian forces, basically start to run out of everything from drinking water to ammunition, that's effectively when we're going to see the additional, mechanized brigades and everything that basically Ukraine is bringing in its own basically strategic reserves to the front line. And just the final point on that is already or continuing, the Ukrainians are encircling Bakhmut, and basically at this point they've captured territory on both flanks. So it might be, in a couple weeks' time, months' time, however long it is, it may be that the Ukrainians perhaps recapture something that took 20 to 40,000 Russian lives in order to get in the first place, which again would be a sort of devastating morale blow, and of course go back into the Prigozhin versus Shoigu contretemps between each other. But that appears to be what the Ukrainians are doing. The Russians have at least three lines of defense across the line of control. the first, and this is something that we were talking about ahead of time, the first line of troops to basically slow down Ukrainian advances. Then the second line is basically the mines, the trenches, the Dragon's Teeth, the other fortifications, and then the strategic reserves behind them. So in that regard, what it seems that Ukrainians are doing is basically keeping all three of those lines busy until such time as they cannot be resupplied further. And that's apparently where they're going to basically see where the points are weakest and attack through those.
Like I said at the beginning of this part of the segment, is there's the success or lack thereof on any of these particular lines of advances is far too early to tell. And we were talking about like I said, I wish I could find the initial post, but there's a post this morning that referenced a Wall Street Journal piece that came out today that sort of gave the sense that even though this is the beginning of the long-awaited counteroffensive, we're still not seeing the main thrust or thrust go through. Both sides are more likely poking, probing, exploring where each other are weak, and we'll probably see some more of that before there's something that can sort of clearly be identified as a main effort. The update about Bakhmut, though, I could only imagine that if Bakhmut changes hands, especially in a relatively short time compared to how long it took Russia to take it, that is only going to drive a deeper wedge in that fissure between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense. Which is good for Ukraine, bad for Russia. It'd be curious to watch who sort of comes out on top of that one, because at that point, as I understand it, Wagner has given over the city to the Russian military, and they're in the process of losing it again.
Or losing. It took them 10 months to a year to take it, and it's lost in a month or a couple of weeks, however long. That it would make the military, the mill bloggers, even more insane. And it's just something, because I read this stuff like every day, just sort of like, there's a lot of information, and sort of that information is sort of what basically becomes the talk of the day when it gets translated and then put on Twitter. And really sort of like the vibes, I should say, on these channels is in fact sort of it's sort of like very clear at this moment, because the Russian sort of state media is based on making sure like Vladimir Putin like has a good day. Like everything is about just like blood, guts, Ukrainians are bad, but ultimately whatever the logical route that's taken is ultimately about like Russia's impending decisive victory in everything. So on Russian state media, you get basically like the stuff that looks insane and is insane in real time. The military bloggers basically have actually a much more straightforward, much more traditional journalism model, which is when they need to put out basically the most accurate information that they have to, one, obviously gain subscribers so that they sell the advertising, and also basically they're always asking for subscription, like paid subscription, plus like sort of just like ongoing support, sort of like NPR type stuff. Donate so that we can continue doing this work. So they have a commercial incentive to give basically the most accurate information possible. So reading them is like, oh, accurate information, or at least like reasonably accurate information, more or less in real time, is actually quite plausible, like from the Russian side. And so I say all this to say that in the last couple of days, the military bloggers had a lot of sort of the sky is falling a couple of days ago, and now they're starting to come to terms with essentially the decisiveness of basically this stage of fighting. They've identified these various towns like Staromlinovske and like these other whatever, all these other towns, Staromaisky, like all these, and they basically say to their subscribers, we have these different lines of defense. Here's what the Ukrainians are doing. Here's our specific successes. Here's their specific successes. But ultimately, folks, look at this picture. Look at the town of Staromlinovska. Look at the town of Tokmak. If the Ukrainian troops are in these towns, and our decisive victories are getting closer and closer to those towns, and then closer and closer to the Russian border, the jig is up. And like that to me is, this weird moment of there's still a lot of fighting in between like a town of Tokmak and basically like the Sea of Azov or to Crimea or to whatever else. But what the mill bloggers are signaling to their own subscribers is that the Russian forces have all these different lines of death, but we don't have infinite forces. We don't have infinite defense. If the Ukrainians get past the last one, they're basically streaming to the seaside. And at that point, nobody knows what's going to happen. And like that's basically where the mill bloggers are. All the crying, gnashing of teeth, rending of garments has already happened. Now it's just, like, let's support our guys in the field. Let's think positive.
Yeah, and I think I know we're going to try and close it out here in a couple of minutes, but I guess kind of what the thing that from my end is from the military professional, at least for the few weeks I have left in uniform, is there's been a lot of talk about the physical aspects of this counteroffensive in the defense, like U.S. and NATO equipment versus these prepared Russian defense in depth lines, and those are going to be big factors to play, right? Like we were talking about before, and as military commentators have noted, like a deliberate assault into a long prepared defense is going to be hard and bloody no matter who you are, right? It's one of the hardest things to do. As somebody noted, it's the only thing harder is doing that in an amphibious sense, right? So like the only thing harder than kind of what the Ukrainians are attempting right now is basically doing, D-Day or Iwo Jima or Taro or that kind of thing, where you don't like you're you don't even have like lots of land to go through. You've got a few ships and narrow stuff. That's the hardest. This is probably the second hardest, a deliberate breach of prepared defenses. And we've seen again anecdotally soda straw that Ukrainians are already taking losses in doing that because part of the way those defenses are designed is that when you expose the resources it takes to clear the obstacles, you expose them to all kinds of other things that are intended to kill those units, but you can't move your other forces forward until you clear those obstacles. So those first waves going through trying to breach, bunkers and trenches and minefields, it's going to be incredibly hard. And the second thing to note, I think, is someone else had mentioned this morning, that this is being done at scale, as you said, like a front line that is almost 1,000 kilometers long. That is a massive battle space, and Ukraine they can't put everything into one place. They're obviously attempting multiple thrusts, and so that is a huge undertaking at scale. And there are very few militaries in the world that have that capability. So the fact that they have to do this out of necessity, but this is also this is a varsity level undertaking that they're doing. Like that should be noted. And I think we were talking as well. The last time, at least I could think of, that a deliberate breach through prepared defensive lines by sort of not near peer, but sort of modern militaries, was Desert Storm. And the expectation was that the U.S. forces doing those breaches would take significant losses. However, losses were relatively small against the Iraqis. I'm not comparing the Iraqis to the Russians, but this takes me to sort of my last point, which is the thing that I'm going to be watching the closest is the reactions of the soldiers to what's going to be high intensity conflict, breaching these defenses or defending the defenses. And you have along the line of contact, those brigades Ukrainians have been preparing. Many of them have probably not been exposed to high intensity combat yet because they've been held back to train them, get them used to the equipment. Same thing with the Russians. A lot of them are those conscripts from the mobilizations earlier or last year, to fill out the lines, to at least like throw bodies at the problems like Russia likes to do. But they have not been truly tested yet in what is going to be high intensity combat as the Ukrainians are trying to breach through it. So you've got two kind of inexperienced forces coming at each other. that's where the human quality of those forces, I think, is going to be the really thing to tell.
Hmm.
And green, inexperienced forces are much more prone to, not necessarily driving an attack all the way through if they start taking casualties, or if you're defending, they're not going to necessarily hold to the last man. The ability of panic and uncertainty and fear to undermine the will of a defending force is very an inexperienced defending force is a pretty big factor. And so I think I don't think we're going to start seeing really large exchanges of territory yet, but if there's a location where that fear and uncertainty starts to sort of unhinge the Russian defenders, it could be irrelevant where along the line that is. That might wind up being where the main drive is thrust through, because once people start running, it's hard to get them to stop until they get to a point where they feel safe again. So we'll likely have a lot more to. This is now the thing we've been looking and waiting for. And this is why we're probably going to have a more rapid episodes, because the next several weeks are what's going to sort of tell the trajectory of the war for the next year or so.
Again, these episodes are going to come pretty thick and fast. And yeah, it's a good way to sort of sort of summarize the fight to come. The Ukrainians have higher morale and more advanced equipment, but it's hard to do combined arms operations, to do joint operations, to do it at scale while the enemy is shooting. And on the other side, the Russians have lower morale, but simpler equipment that might be easier to use for people who don't want to be there, but also people who don't want to be there are going to try and flee at the first opportunity. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, the Ukrainians have everything to fight for. Those Russian defenders, they will fight hard enough to live to see another sunrise. That could be in the trenches. That could be a voluntary or involuntary moving 50 kilometers away from the trenches so they feel safe. So I think that's the thing that at least I'll be watching here as the counteroffensive really starts to unfold. So I think we're past. We want to get you off to your next thing, so we'll make sure I'll stop talking right now. To our audience, thank you again for listening to another episode, and we'll likely have more updates as things develop on the battlefield. Yuval, thank you as always, and we'll see you here on the next one.
Pleasure. See you soon.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.